So if you could please fill out these questions. Let's see, can everyone see that? There we go. Great, thank you. All right. Okay. Let's go to the next one. Ah, here comes the next one. Okay, good. Thank you.
And on that one, it looks like it's not accepting uh, check and all, so check the one that was most appropriate, I guess.
Oh, okay. And this one, just type in your answer where you're located at. Great. Texas. Excellent. Good. Looks like we've got a great representation here from the West and the Southwest. That's good. All right. Oh, we still got them coming in here. Okay. And the last one. Who do you work for? All right. Oh, we still got them coming in. Okay, good. Okay. All right, David, I think we're good to go.
All right. Well, thanks, Janine. And thanks, folks, for filling out that poll. That gives us a little bit of information about who's attending and what your interest may be in today's presentation, which helps us gear the presentation a little towards that. I am David C. Schultz, and I'm with the Pacific Northwest Research Station and one of the principal investigators with the Northwest Fire Science Consortium. And today, if you've attended the webinars here over the last couple months, we had the one a month and a half ago with predictive services. And if you were following along with that, you may have saw that this year, as you look towards what may happen, the Northwest, the California, Central Idaho, all are looking at being hotter and drier than normal, so probably above the average along that. So a fairly good potential for some large fires, large and costly fires in those areas. And what we're trying to focus on today is, okay, so how do you prepare for those? What do you consider, as you're evaluating and preparing for that? And then once you get in an event like that, how do you react? What do you consider at that time in your decisions? How do you manage the risk? That's really where we're getting here today with the strategic risk assessment. And we're joined today, very happy to have with us Steve Gage, who is the Assistant Director for Fire and Aviation Management within the Forest Service at the National Office. And Steve's located here in Boise, Idaho, where I am too, but in separate offices. We're also joined today by Kevin Martin, who is the Forest Supervisor on the Umatilla National Forest. So he's right there kind of in the middle of all that area that's listed as hotter and drier this year as well. And Kevin can share with us today a little bit as an agency administrator. How does he respond? How does he react once he gets really into the season and looks at these strategic risk assessments, how does he consider that information in making more tactical decisions? So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Steve at this time, and I'll be moderating today. So if you have any questions, any clarity as we're going along, go ahead and type that in now. If you have more general questions related to certain specific aspects of something, hold those for a little bit, and we'll take the questions and answers at the end of our session. So we'll probably have around 25 minutes, 35 minutes of presentation, and that'll leave us with 20 minutes or so for questions and answers. So go ahead, Steve.
Thanks, David. Just a little background for this presentation. We put this together to talk to our incident management team members that are trying to qualify for the highest level at Type 1 qualifications for a course that we do down in Tucson every year. So as we go through this, you'll see that this is geared towards the incident management team perspective with that look at strategic risk assessment and how do they interact with other decision makers. And Kevin is going to be on and talk about his role as the line officer, and so from my role as the incident management team member, how do we interact? And I have for a number of years been on incident management teams and been a Type 1 IC and that kind of stuff, so I understand that interaction piece, but it truly is very important. So we're going to talk about some terms, strategic risk assessment, and kind of the way we look at it from the incident management team perspective. So the first slide up here talks about Winston Churchill had a great idea of the evaluation of uncertain, hazardous, and conflicting information. When we get into a wildfire situation, there's a lot of uncertain and conflicting information that we have out there that we have to deal with as we get through that. And you'll see through the rest of these slides how we try to do a systematic approach to try to look through this stuff. So can we get the next slide, or can I get on as a, I just realized I don't have the clicker. Next button, please.
Okay. Now, Steve, you ought to be able to use those arrows down in the left-hand corner.
Okay, I'll give that a try, but we'll see how it works. Anyway.
See how it works? You're on your iPad again?
Yep. So
okay. Yeah, I can't remember how those were set
I'll
up.
give it a try.
Go ahead. If not, just keep saying next. Thanks.
Okay. This is Curtis Eaton is one of our operations section chiefs, and this is his kind of his quick analysis for how he looks at a strategic assessment for risk at a buffet. First, he takes a look at all the food, and then he analyzes the options and develops a strategy to move effortlessly and efficiently. Grab the shrimp, then the shrimp, crab legs, skip the bread and salad, and leave room for the dessert bar. So that's just that whole concept is you assess, analyze, and develop your strategy around that. So Dave, I'm not getting any movement at all. So now strategy, the Greek origin is on a generalship, and the modern definition for strategy is plan of action or policy designed to achieve major or overall gain. So that's kind of, most people use that term of strategy. It's that overall end game of where we're headed and how we're going to get there. Next. So around that are the concepts of space and just keep going in time, and then of resources or assets. And those are all put against some values to be protected, and we'll talk about that a little bit more as we go along. So when we talk about a strategy, we answer these, if you look at these 4 questions, and just keep popping them up there, Dave, would be fine. Where are we going into the future? How are we going to apply our resources into or against the problem? And how are we going to go about doing this? That's that kind of the big thought process. And then when and how do we finish with finesse? And these 4 terms come out of a book called Flawless Execution, which is on the next click. There you go, by James D. Murphy. He put these thought processes together. It really does kind of define what it is that we need to do as we move forward in developing our strategy. Next, please. So here's the time and space kind of a wedge, and as we develop our strategy, you'll see we have values to be protected out there. And then as time moves forward and we have decision space and we have additional space to work with, it will help us develop the strategy. But as the time wedge moves on, you'll see that our space is limited, and it sometimes overruns our values to be protected. So we have to be very cognizant of that time-space wedge as we move forward. Next. There we go. So what is a risk? Basically, the Webster definition is a risk is the probability of loss or the possibility of a bad outcome. Now, a bad outcome could be also described as an outcome that wasn't desired, didn't quite come out the way we thought it was, and the term bad really kind of is kind of a misnomer because people define bad in a different way, but every action that we deal with on an incident has an outcome, every action we take. So that's the definition. And then for the wildland fire perspective, we say risk is equal to the probability and severity of a loss from undesired outcomes linked to hazards found in the fire environment. So those are kind of if we keep that as our baseline as we move through this, that'll help. Next slide, please. So if we have values out there that we need to protect, and what kicks off this whole risk process is the fact that we have an event. And in this case, we're talking about a fire. So once we have the event, then we create a hazards, because we have to put people or we have to engage this fire at some point in time. So now the hazards have a target in many ways. So next. So then the hazards, we have to determine what are the probability that these hazards will affect our value that needs to be protected. And then we have to make what are the severity of those impacts, what are the consequences of those impacts as we go through this process in our mind and as we look at this. And all of that together then, we hit the next button, all of that equals the risk. So we have the event that creates the hazards that then has a probability impact on our values. We determine the severity and the consequence of that severity onto the risk. So next slide. Oh yeah, all risk is personal. There are many of us on this call, I'm sure, that do some things that we ride motorcycles, we skydive, we do some things that people would call risky, but in our own minds we don't think it's risky because all risk is personal, and we all have a different degree of acceptance for that risk. So if you keep that concept in mind as we talk about strategic risk assessment, as you talk to people about risk, understand that everybody has varying levels of risk acceptance. So just keep that in mind. All risk is personal. Next slide. So all risk is a perceived risk. And you have to understand that there's fear behind risk. And the fear of that consequence, that outcome is what, and the severity of that outcome is what a lot of people measure risk around. And again, because it's personal, it would be on a varying scale. And a lot of that's based on factors like your mental model, how you view the world, your beliefs, sometimes your organizational position. And the other thing to understand is that risk isn't just about harm to a person. There are a lot of ways that we risk things. It could be risk to budget dollars. It could be risk to reputation. It could be risk to other hard values, campgrounds, communities, power lines, all of that infrastructure stuff. So don't just think of risk as getting somebody hurt. So, and also behind that fear, based on those beliefs, your mental models, those kinds of things, it could very easily distort your judgment and your ability to make rational decisions. And I'm sure if we polled the group about have they ever had one of those where the fear because of a risk caused them to make an irrational decision, we could probably come up with a lot of definitions and a lot of examples. So next. Again, back to all risk is personal, and it's all rolled into that. So next. We talk about facts are facts, but perceptions are reality, and because of the way we perceive risk is personal and it has all those factors behind it, many times the perception of the risk is more powerful to people than the actual fact. So again, that's one of those human factors we have to keep in mind. Next, please. So there's an old firefighter proverb that basically says the fire doesn't really care what you think. It just cares about how you react to it. So just keep that in mind. So we go to the next, please. So how do we go through this process then with those thoughts in our background? Risk is personal, and the time wedge and time and space, and what do we have as far as assets or resources to put against it. So strategic risk assessment can actually start early before there's any smoke in the air, where we identify those values. And those values could be life and property, it could be infrastructure, it could be social, it could be economic, and one of the big ones that Kevin and others in his role have to deal with is that political risk factor. And then we talk about natural and cultural resources that are out there as we move through this process. Those are all identifiable values to be protected. Next slide, please. So here's where you have those discussions early on, and we just encourage people to go to the map, and look at the area that you're responsible for and circle those things. Where might those values be? Next. And then ask the question, what's a value? Why is it a value, and how valuable is it? What would the priority be as we put things on there? Life safety is always number one. So those always have a high priority when we start looking at strategic risk assessment. But the rest of those in there, where do they fit in that in a matrix of how that looks, and kind of a hierarchical look at where those things are? So that's where you have to have those good discussions with all of the, not only key staff, but your subject matter experts, your cooperators, your partners, the communities, all of those things. So next, where we determine then the probability of that value being impacted. So if you have a really nice campground, or a summer camp at the head of a big canyon that's likely to have a fire in it, there's a probability with a fire in the bottom of that drainage that it could have a pretty high impact on that summer camp. So next slide, please. So one of the things that we tend to do in the wildland fire community and the fire service as a whole is we tend to reach out and look at others that have done some things that help us get to where we are. And so we read a lot of books, and we borrow a lot of information from a lot of people. And here's one from Sun Tzu, where we identify, define, and understand the factors that dealing with risk and probability, and how you approach things in your strategic risk assessment. And the first factor is that the known versus unknown. What do we know and what do we don't know? What are those factors that we can control, and what are the factors that we can't control? The big one in wildfire is we can't control the weather. We can't control the topography. So we have to then look at what we can control. We talk about strengths and weaknesses. And many times we don't want to talk about what our weaknesses are, but the weakness for strategic risk assessment may be travel time for your firefighting assets to get into that area to protect a value at risk or engage a fire someplace in the back country somewhere. Then we talk about dangers and opportunities, threats and hazards. So if we could hit the down arrow there, and we'll go to the next little piece on this slide. And then base your assumptions on reality and not hope. We always tell people hope is not a good strategy. What are the realities? And again, the next slide will talk to us a little bit about the concept, again, back to the time and space wedge, because it's very important to remember these are key factors that, that time wedge. Go ahead and put up to the values there. So we have 3 values that we identify here to be protected. The number 1 is an infrastructure. Could be a power plant, power line, water system, a major highway, that goes through a mountain pass or something. High value, low probability, high consequence. The second one could be the social aspect of maybe high smoke in the area, which was a high value and high probability and a high consequence. The third value to be protected is some sort of an ecological, where you have a low value, but it's a high probability given the time and the space that it's going to be impacted, but it is of lower consequence just due to the nature of what it is. So if we hit the next slide. So as we're doing that process, again, remember that time and space wedge and how long it's going to take you to get into that. So then again, we do this risk analysis after we've identified what those risks are, and then we have to ask that question: how can we protect these values at risk? And again, this is where you get the key staff together, your incident commanders, cooperators, and you discuss that time, space, conditions, availability of assets or resources to get there. What are all my options to protect this value at risk if we have that possibility? It doesn't mean you have to examine every possibility, but at least it really helps if you have a pretty good idea. Now remember that to protect some of these values at risk, it may be upfront work before you actually have a wildfire. It could be fuels mitigation work around a community, or fuels mitigation work around a campground, or any other value to be protected. Next, please. So then, after we get into the strategy and intent, then we communicate or we socialize this information from our assessment and our analysis. We'd like to document the end state. The end state is, what we would like to have this thing look like when we're all done. And then success is defined. What does success look like? So that it really identifies the target. What is the desired end-state success, so we're all shooting at the same bullseye, so to speak, as we move ourselves forward. Then we outline some courses of actions. Some lines of effort can be mapped out. And then from that, you can identify key tasks that need to be done along the way, key efforts, contacts, the number of assets you might need. And then we move on to this concept of the leader's intent. Kevin will talk about that here shortly, but how do we explain it to the folks that are coming, the assets, the resources that have been ordered up? How do we explain what it is we're trying to accomplish to the public, other officials, which is that political piece, the cooperators, those other agencies that are coming to help, and the stakeholders? Many times that's the citizens in the communities. So how do we explain that? And understanding that we're working on uncertainty, and we're working on not having all the information that everybody might like to have. So next slide. So in this, as we communicate the strategy, we're trying to get concurrence again on what's important. Then we want to know, why is it important? Is it a historical building? Is it the only mountain pass to get from one side from one valley to the next, and we really need to keep the highway open? Is it a railroad that passes through where you get $2 to $10 million worth of product going through on that railway? And then how important is it, which is really a key question to ask, because we talk about value at risk and we talk about how important is it. That's basically how much you're willing to risk in firefighter, public safety, those kinds of things to protect that value. So with that, can we have the next click? That's where the intent and the leadership comes in to help communicate that. And again, it's really good if we can all be on the same page as to why these things are important and what's important and how important is it. This has a very, very high value. How do you communicate that? And especially to the responders. And we talk about, this is some more Sun Tzu stuff, that strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And threats are also considered hazards. You know, if we're going to have to fly aircraft in there, you know, if there's power lines in the way, you know, that's a pretty good big threat to helicopters and fixed wing aircraft. So, next. So this risk sharing dialogue, again, we utilize the Red Book, and the Red Book is it's the interagency standards for fire and fire aviation operations, and it can actually be found on the website. If you Google Red Book, it'll come up for you. But Chapter 5, there are some 10 questions that are in there that we like to answer. Then there's the 5 R's, the 5 rights: right place, right time, right reasons, right actions, and those kinds of things that are in there. We also talk about conducting risk-sharing dialogues with senior leadership and political appointees if it's important. I like to say that wildland fire is like a 3-legged stool, and the 3 legs are social, economic, and political. And the first 2, the social and economic, which includes infrastructure, they're made out of wood that could be finely shaped on a lathe, you know, with your tools. But that 3rd leg, that political leg, is made out of titanium. And many times, and Kevin can probably attest to this, that's the one we get beat up with the most, is the political one, because there are a lot of factors that deal with that. So the more engagement we can do in risk-sharing dialogue with the political people at the local level, at the state level, at the regional level, at the national level, it really helps people understand what it is we're trying to do. Then we talk to people about 360-degree leadership, being able to lead up, to lead down, to lead sideways, and really include everybody in this risk-sharing dialogue. Next, please. So as we go through that process, then after you've done, you develop strategy, your lines of effort, and you've had these risk-sharing dialogues, then somebody's got to make a decision. And the more risk-informed decision we can make, we tend to think that those decisions should have a better outcome for us. But also remember that every decision has a lifespan. And that decision the lifespan could be an hour, it could be a day, it could be a week, it could be a month. But all decisions have a lifespan, and in a very dynamic world like a wildfire, many times we have to go back and develop this time frame to revisit those decisions and make sure we're still on track. Now, one of the other things we like to talk about is this confirmation bias. And many times the people that have ownership of the decision, they made that decision based on the information they had at the time, and they get wedded to it. And so you just have to be cognizant that you could have some confirmation bias where you take all of the information that you have coming in and you move that information to help confirm that you made the best decision possible. So remember also that decisions are neither good nor bad at the time they're made. You need to understand that there's possibility of different outcomes from each decision. Some could be desired, some could be undesired, but there are outcomes to every decision. Some are known immediately, some are known long term. But at the time you make them, there's no good decision, no bad decision. That's all based on the outcome. Next slide, please. So as we develop the strategy and we get into lines of effort, then we do our operational planning, the main effort, the supporting efforts, and then we talk about our PACE process, which is we develop a primary plan, an alternate plan, a contingency plan, and then we have an emergency plan if things go gunny sack on us and nothing else is working. We try to have that emergency plan in our back pocket. Next slide. So in the application process in the incident command system, we utilize a planning cycle where we have the operations and the safety officer and the command and general staff to get together. And again, they go through this process of the intent based on the strategy. You know, what are the knowns, what are the unknowns, the hazards, again, the course of actions, the lines of efforts, the values to be protected, the risk versus the gain, that success being defined. Then we're going to identify in our plan who, where, when, and the time lag and time tag. In other words, when do they go in, when do they come out? And then after the planning cycle's done, then before our operational period starts, we have an operational briefing. We try to explain the values to be protected. What is it we're trying to accomplish in that end state? And then we emphasize real-time risk management. And when we talk about that, if you go to the next slide, it really does kind of explain it, in that we basically talk to our fire folks about 3 levels of risk management. The first one being strategic, which basically is across the entire lifespan of the incident, and is communicated with the public, and again, it has data and time analysis, and all of that stuff we talked about a little earlier is all built into there, where we talk about the consequences, probabilities of what might happen. The second level is operational, where we talk about those divisions on the fire, where we divide the fire up into manageable pieces for people. And those are the operational pieces. And we look at some risk protocol tools that we use in our planning process. And those ICS 215, 215As are just form numbers. But basically it identifies, the 215 identifies what it is tactically we want to do. And then the 215A really looks at what are the hazards that are out there, risk, and then it's a risk mitigation. And based on that is a go, no-go decision as to whether we're going to put people out there and keep after that. Then the real time is for our fire folks on the ground or anybody else involved in the fire. If they're out there doing something in the theater area where the fire's going on, they have to make real-time decisions about, can I do this safely? Can I do this? Is it in line with the operational components? Is it in line with the strategy? If they run into a problem, how do they communicate that back up? So that's kind of the 3 levels in a real quick glance as we go through that. 3 levels: strategic, operational, and real-time. So if you hear those in any other discussion, remember strategic's the big look picture. Operational is by operational period, which are normally 12 hours at a time, sometimes 24. And then the real time is like right now, when you're out there and you're faced with something. Next slide, please. So this is kind of a quick wrap up. Strategic assessment is about continually looking at the big picture and managing the risk. As information changes, as it will, because the fires are very dynamic and there's a lot of uncertainty involved, and a lot of things we can't control. So it's out there and moving. Remember to look at the big picture. It's looking at managing risk, reevaluating the values to be protected, or those VARs, values at risk. And risk is about uncertainty, and the more complexity you have, the more uncertainty you have. So it's a very dynamic situation. And if we'll click the next one. So this is something I put together for the folks that I believe that incident management is a mindful balance between perceptions that people have, they bring with them, the expectations of the public, the elected officials, the people that the incident management teams work for, and how we execute that. And then we should be maybe not always defining success as win-lose, but doing the right things for the right reasons at the right times. And to me, that will help us get through this process. So next. As I told you, us in the fire business, we're not sometimes the smartest, but we know where to go and dig and look for information to help us move forward. So here's just a few of the books that, you know, we tell people are good ones to look at. That Everyday Survival and Deep Survival, really good books. How We Decide really does take you into the human mind about the things our mind does to us that aren't necessarily helpful. So next slide, I think, is the question slide. Oh, I'm sorry, Kevin, you're up.
Good morning. My name's Kevin Martin. I'm the forest supervisor on the Umatilla National Forest. I've been the forest supervisor here for 10 years now. I'm an advanced agency administrator for the certified for the Forest Service. I deal with
Kevin,
incident management team. Can you hear me? Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you, Kevin. No problem.
Okay.
Yeah, you're fine.
Okay, thank you. You will hear a number. I'm going to talk a little bit about how I do things, what I think about as the fire season throughout the year, and as the fire season comes on. A lot of it will tie really nicely into what Steve just talked about. I'm going to first start off with the Forest Service has the chief of the Forest Service puts out a letter of intent every spring. And Steve discussed a lot of that, but it's for 2015. The letter of intent was very well laid out, and it talks about the intent as fully evaluating the risk, considering the people we serve. That's the firefighters and the employees that work with us, our partners, and our communities, and then the landscapes that we protect. And success is defined as safely achieving reasonable objectives with the least firefighter exposure while enhancing stakeholder support. So how do I think about that? Well, Steve talked about pre-season preparedness. Pre-season is hugely important. It's critical to the success of your success when that fire starts. You need to build decision maker and stakeholder support. You need to increase understanding of risk management with key stakeholders and partners. A great example of that is annually we meet with our partners around. I'm in Eastern Oregon, and we have an Eastern Oregon agency administrators meeting. And what we did this year is we spent time talking about risk management and what that means to us. And we've got other agencies, the BLM, the Forest Service participates in it, the state agencies, Oregon Department of Forestry participates, some of the Fire Service folks, and we talked about what risk management is and what it means to each of us, each of our agencies, so that we kind of understand where each other is coming from. Another thing that we like to work on is agency administrator capacity. Lots of changes in the agency administrators in the Forest Service, lots of movement, lots of new folks coming in. There's some things that we can do pre-season and throughout the season to help folks be successful. There's training opportunities for sure. Shadow assignments are a wonderful opportunity, whether it's a shadow assignment with a group of folks or going out and just shadowing an individual agency administrator. Sand table exercises, drills, WFDS practice, we always try to do on all the district. Some level of WFDS preseason, so when that fire starts, that the folks that are going to be doing that are prepared and updated on how to do that. And then simulations is another good opportunity, and doing those with your partners. And then I like to assume that, I like to share that folks on the forest are available to participate on incident management teams. I like to let new employees know about incident management teams, what that's about, what their opportunities are, and it's really important for the agencies. I'm a big user of incident management teams, and when I make that phone call, means I need some help. It's good. I really want to know that somebody's going to come, and in order for somebody to come, there needs to be participants on those teams, and so I work really hard with my employees here on the forest to assure that folks are aware and have the opportunity to participate. And then you need to assess risk at a landscape level, and this is not just looking at the National Forest Systems lands, or I noticed there were some Park Service folks on there. Not just looking at the lands that you manage, but also look at your neighbors' lands and work with your neighbors in your adjoining lands. Your land and resource management plans, your county plans, state plans, all of that sort of information can be preloaded into WFDS, into the system, so that it's available when an incident starts. So it's easy to gather up all that information and have those conversations ahead of time as well. And then this is, Steve talked about this, is develop that common understanding of values. What's important, why is it important, and how important is it? It's really interesting. When you have that conversation and you do that with your partners and your stakeholders, things that you thought might have been important may not be quite as important as something somebody else has is as important. And so having that conversation ahead of time can really clarify that importance. And when a fire is going on and you're running and gunning, it's late at night, you've kind of thought some of that stuff out, so you can kind of have that clarified ahead of time. And then another opportunity is to engage key stakeholders and partners in simulations. A really interesting example I participated in a simulation that included 2 states, included two state agencies, included a watershed for a community, and what was really interesting is as we were going through this simulation, we actually asked a NEMO team to come in and help us set this simulation up. The city manager came and just kind of was planning on making a kind of a drive-by. Here I am, I'm going to sit for an hour. I don't have all day to sit through this simulation. And what was really interesting as we worked our way through that simulation, we could see that he got up, he made some phone calls, canceled the rest of his day, and ended up participating in it because there was some things we were talking about that they hadn't even thought about, information that we were sharing and conversations that we were having that was really important to the city, and having that simulation ahead of time gets folks thinking about what some of those what ifs are. And then you need to have dialogue, additional dialogue with your line officers, your neighbors and stakeholders to understand the alternatives for risk-based decision. It's especially important when there might be an expectation that a fire becomes a long-term event. You need to kind of understand what a long-term event really means to a unit, to a forest, to an area, to a community. Long-terms can almost be incidents in themselves. They can go on for 30, 40, 50, 60 days, and you need to adjust that level of engagement based on exposure of responders at risk and level of risk to values to be protected. But it's important to think about that ahead of time. And then during the incident phase, that's when your preseason work all pays off. You can apply those risk management principles. It's really easy to talk about risk management principles. It's really more interesting when you're implementing in the heat and stress of an event, and that preseason work and thought and discussion can be really important. And it can help you really make decisions based on firefighter, public safety, values at risk, and probabilities of success. And then to be successful, we want to follow, the standards for risk management. And Steve talked about these. I'm not going to go over them in great detail. But my main focus here is to get you thinking about the importance of relationships, that preseason planning, and how important that can be for your success during an incident, and then spending time thinking about the what ifs. So you complete that risk assessment. The preseason, those relationships are in place. You're building that assessment with your stakeholders, with your partners. You got to talk about the probability of harm and possible mitigations. A really good example of this, we had a large fire in Washington. Wasn't even on the forest yet. We participated in a conversation about what was at risk and where the values were. Made some decisions, and the decision resulted in the National Forest getting a very large fire, but it was the right decision because we needed to concentrate limited resources to protect the highest values. So then you complete that risk assessment. You need to consider your alternatives. A really good and a lot of that can again be preloaded. I see Chris Stein's on the call today. A perfect example is Hell's Canyon National Recreation Area. They get so many fires over there. They know the right place and the right ridge and those things to put those lines, and there's no reason to put them in those other things. And you can have that preloaded when you go to Hell's Canyon. You want to get one of the local folks there to come sit down with the team because they already have all that information available, and it'll cause you to make the right decision and not a poor decision. And then you need to have good communications. You need to spend time with your local governments, your city, your county, your agencies, your tribes, your congressional staffers, your interest groups, and if you've got good relationships in place already, boy, that sure makes that work hard. So spend time on those relationships ahead of time. And then you need to share that dialogue. You need to get alignment. You need to get alignment with the forest, your local office, your regional office, your national office. You need to get it with your partners. You need to get it with your communities. You need to make sure the stakeholders and employees all understand the thought process behind the decision. And this is a great time. Steve talked about the PACE model. This is where a good time to be thinking about that PACE model. Folks really like to know what's your primary, your alternate, your contingency, and your emergency plans. They like to know that you've thought those out ahead of time and that you're available. Then make that decision, document it. For the Forest Service, you document that in WFDS. It's good to put pictures, maps, and all those sorts of things because people are looking at WFDS and evaluating your thoughts. And then continue to monitor and adjust. I always ask the IMTs when they come to me that I want them to be nimble and be prepared to take advantage of opportunities. I was on an agency administrator in a fire in Arizona. We didn't have the resources available because of all the fires that were going on across the nation. So we had a plan in place. All of a sudden, several hotshot crews became available, which allowed us to do some different things, and we were able to take advantage of that and change where that fire ended up on the landscape. So being nimble with the right resources, and then do an after-action review. You can always find things that we could do differently or better, and we should always strive to learn. So this risk decision framework, this is right out of Chapter 5 of the Red Book that Steve talked about. This is also, for me, this goes right into my WFDS and my rationale section. You answer these questions, you can usually work your way down through that. So sound decision making for wildlife response relies on identifying those reasonable objectives for protection of critical values at risk while considering a firefighter exposure and probability of success. There's no perfect alternative, but we don't want to bear the costs in terms of exposure unless it's worthwhile to do so. We want to be on the right ridge. We need to understand the resources we have in order for us to be successful. So a risk-based decision is a conscious trade-off. Protection, exposure, and it's made by the agency administrator. Got communications, sharing that risk, sharing that information, sharing those decisions, building that alignment is critical, and then a continual monitoring and adjusting. Steve, I think, talked about, decisions are decisions at the time, and they, as new information or conditions change, you make adjustments. Effective interaction between agency administrator and incident commanders is also essential. You need to build a relationship as soon as that incident commander shows up. It's a relationship, and it has to occur quickly. And there are ways and opportunities to get a preseason jump on this as well. For example, the incident commanders usually have meetings, incident management teams have meetings, agency administrators and fire leadership meetings. Often the incident commanders are at those as well, and many of the team members. So you can build some of that pre-season, again, those relationships, and again, that's so important to have those strong relationships. Again, this is the risk decision right out of the red book. Again, this is the rational section in the WUPDIS for me. Answer these questions. Select a course of action that the least exposure given the reasonable objectives. Make it safe, and then monitor and adjust. Again, this is where I'm thinking of the PACE model, primary plan, alternate strategy, contingency strategy, and emergency plans. Those are my alternatives that I'm thinking about, and I'm going to be asking the incident management team. Great tools. Steve talked about the Red Book. It's online. That's really a great tool to get your hands on and understand. Easy to carry with you. I usually download it on my iPad. That way I've got it with me. Line Officer Desk Guide. The Forest Service has a Line Officer Desk Guide that's really helpful as well. You can get that off the national website. And then, of course, the Chief's Letter. And I think the Line Officer Desk Guide and the Chief's Letter might be on the two of the documents that are available here on the webinar.
Yeah, if we can get the work right.
Okay, and then there we are for questions.
All right. Well, thanks, Kevin and Steve. I want to let you know. Yeah, it sounds like risk assessment and risk decision making, really pulls upon a variety of sciences to come together and be able to play itself out. Right now, we do have the opportunity for questions, folks. We have about a minute or so that we can take questions. I guess I'll get you guys. Go ahead, Janine.
Yeah, so I have a question that was forwarded to me by Sean Hopkins. I will go ahead and read this. He says, I work in a multi-agency group during large wildfires to communicate with the public about potential smoke impacts to their community. We've moved to a one-stop shop format where we post information to the Washington Smoke blog. In the past couple seasons, we've been fortunate to have air resource advisors assigned to large fires who can communicate directly with the IMT. What suggestions do you have for communicating with the IMT if an air resource advisor is not assigned to the fire?
Well, Janine, from the incident management perspective, I think the key is that reach out and find out who your subject matter experts are in the area. The local health department, air quality control boards, those kinds of things those people can help you also if you don't have an air resource advisor assigned. A side note, we just had another training course for some of those people. So we're trying to build more and more of that cadre because smoke is truly one of the big social risks that we deal with. But I would just say reach out ahead of the fire season and find out who's available in the neighborhood.
And this is Kevin, and you can always work through the host agency. Oftentimes we have resource advisors also available. They may not have the skills and background, but they might be good contacts to gather information and share information as well.
Mm-hmm. Did you have any others at this time, Janine?
No, that was the only one that I had received.
Okay. So both Steve and Kevin, you guys both talked about risk sharing. So first, Steve, I was hoping you might be able to distinguish risk sharing, how that might be different than risk transfer or risk acceptance. And then, Kevin, I was hoping you might be able to talk a little bit about what does that dialogue really look like when you go forward and you really actually, how do you engage in that dialogue around risk sharing, and how does it play itself out?
Okay, I'll start off. When we talk about risk sharing, a lot of that is getting buy-in from other people, that we've talked about what's at risk, what's the probabilities, all of those factors, and we share that data, we share the decision making, um, and we do a lot of communication around that. Risk transference is basically you have a fire and it's kind of hung up on the side of the mountain, and it's not a safe place to put ground troops in, so the decision's made to, oh, we'll just fly aircraft in there and we'll continue to fly helicopters and fixed wing aircraft. And basically what we're doing is we're transferring the majority of that risk from the ground firefighters to the aviation firefighters. And so, that's one way that happens, instead of coming up with alternative plans.
So this is Kevin. Again, it's that relationships. We work really hard to build relationships, and then it's the constant communications. There's very seldom anymore. It seems like that we have fires that are just one agencies, so we're typically sharing those. So having that preseason conversation about some of the what ifs in particular areas, doing some simulations, I think is really eye-opening. But during the event, making sure that you're having really good, honest, open conversations about, why you're thinking the way you are, what's at risk, and then making sure that you're sharing that, you're getting alignment internally and externally, so folks understand and agree, and sometimes that takes some time. And I'll tell you, if you spend time ahead of time building those relationships, it makes it a lot easier when things are going not so well. What's really interesting is when you get sent somewhere else and you don't have those relationships in place, but you're there to help. You have to build a lot of relationships. You can lean on some of the local folks because they probably have relationships in place. So you need to find out quickly from your agency standpoint who those folks are that could be really helpful, and then spend some time with folks.
All right. What I'm doing here is I'm actually going to try to bring up a couple of the documents that were mentioned earlier here. So we had, whoops. Yeah, right now in the file share, if your layouts change, you see the file share down here in the right-hand corner. Those are some of the documents that we mentioned. So you should be able to click on one of those and download it. The first one there is the Forest Service Chief's Letter of Intent that Steve talked about. There's also there, both in PDF as well as a Word document, are the Chief's Risk Management Protocol, the drafts that are out from this year. And then we also have the final line officer's desk reference, which you ought to be able to download too if that would be of interest to you as well. So while folks are looking at that, I do have one more question I'd like to ask of you guys to see how that works. And it's basically one that maybe this year is very timely. When Steve, you laid out your axis there with time and space, and you talked about ecological values, and you had them kind of listed, kind of as a low value, a high probability. Has anything changed this year, in particular now with the sage grouse and the emphasis that's being placed on that ecological value?
Well, and David, that there has been a lot of discussion in those areas, sage grouse habitat. And probably we picked a bad example to put on that slide, but it's one of those values to be protected, a value at risk. There is a lot of emphasis in the Great Basin area around sage grouse habitat, and it will have a factor. It will be a big decision point as to how we engage fire, and it has truly become a higher value at risk for many people.
And as you mentioned, really the perception of risk is reality. So this year, that perception of risk associated with the sage grouse is probably going to be larger than it's been in the past. And then, as you also mentioned, it's also very personal. And all risk is personal, so you have to take that into account, which gets into, the whole content in which the event is occurring. So without any other additional questions, I think we're good for today. So I want to thank folks for joining us today. Really appreciate folks being able to make it today. And once again, I want to say thank both Steve and Kevin for your time today.
Welcome.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Glad it worked out.